out more. And today you get to find out more about the book that Warner Brothers purchased that inspired the new Elvis movie, which had a fantastic opening weekend. Maybe you got out to see it. It actually tied with Top Gun, earning $30.5 million. And joining us today on Good Things is author James Dickerson. He wrote Colonel Tom Parker, The Curious Life of Elvis Presley's Eccentric Manager. So welcome, James.
Well, good day to you. But first, let me say, go Rebels.
Oh yes, you can definitely do that. They had a good weekend too. So Mississippi was just showing up and showing out over the weekend. So yes, go Rebels, and congrats to you, James, on all the success that your book has received. I noticed that the book was actually published back in 2018. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of books or documentaries on Elvis's life, before then. So what gap in his story did you feel like needed to be told?
Well, first of all, I should say it was first published in 2001. So that means I wrote it almost 24 years ago. And it had a run with a New York publisher, and as books tend to do, it went out of print, and I bought the rights back. And then I published it with Sartorius, my publishing company.
Well, that was a wise move to do.
It was a wise move, and so I'm delighted with everything that's happening for it. You write a book and you just keep moving and doing other things, and every once in a while something will come back like this.
Well, let's talk about the book first, and then we'll get to the movie, because I find this kind of fascinating, because you still found a gap in the Elvis story. So what was it about Colonel Tom Parker that made you, James, as an author, say, let me put on my investigative hat and sort of learn a little bit more about this angle of Elvis's story?
Well, I think it began because I wrote two books with Scotty Moore, who was Elvis's first guitarist and manager. And he told me, we talked about Colonel Parker in his books, but he told me more stuff. And finally I realized I needed to do a book on the greatest con man who ever lived. And so I decided to do the book probably in 1998 or something. I don't know. It's been a long time. But and so it got great reviews and had a really nice run. But then 4 years ago is when I decided I'd get movie referrals, and I would send them to the publisher, and nothing would ever happen. And so then finally I just decided to purchase the book back. And it did come out in 2018, but also in 2018, my agent got a call from Warner Brothers. We never pitched the book to them. We never asked them to buy it. And they said they wanted to buy the book. And so my agent talked to him, and they made an offer to option it. Now, I already knew that probably 95% of the books that are optioned never are going to be made into movies. It just doesn't happen. It's a rarity, really. It seems like a lot of movies come out that were inspired by books, but when you look at the number and then look at the number of books that are published every year in the millions, and the number that are actually made, and so it was quite an unbelievable thing. But it was they made an offer to option it, and I turned it down because it didn't have any profit sharing for me. My agent went back and said if I didn't get points on the box office, then it was no deal.
Good for you.
They accepted that premise. And so the way book options work, they paid a little bit of money to hold the book for 2 years to see if they could get a movie put together. And then the way options work, once they decided, or at the end of that period, if they wanted to purchase the book, then I would get a six-figure number from them to purchase it. And so I'm happy. I'm happy with the option, and I'm happy with my percentage of the box office.
I can imagine that you had a very good weekend. Then you may have had a better weekend than the Rebels did, James. But I think this is cool. And one, it shows that, nationally, internationally, people are still interested in the Mississippi Boy, which is sort of Elvis, and that there's still parts of his life that maybe we haven't fully uncovered or, discovered. When you learned that Tom Hanks was going to play Colonel Tom Parker, did you feel like that was a good fit?
I thought it would be good for the movie. I mean, he makes good. I'm a fan of Tom Hanks. I didn't know how he would be, and since I haven't seen the movie, all I've seen are the trailers. So I'm not a good critic from just the trailers. But yeah, I mean that. Well, what surprised me was Austin Butler, because I thought when I heard that he was going to play Elvis, I thought, well, can he do that? But then I saw the trailers, and people have been trying to do Elvis ever since he died, and Austin has come as close as anyone I've ever seen. I mean, he does a great job.
He's definitely getting rave reviews, and the fact that he even sang his own music there as young Elvis, I know, is really grabbing a lot of people's attention. It'll be interesting when you do get to see the movie, James, if you think that they, did justice to the book, right? I think so many folks always who have the book first and then go and watch the movie, or watch the movie and then read the books, they wonder, how much of it aligns. But you see so much of Elvis's family coming out and talking about how, I think one of the quotes from Marie Presley was, "What a remarkable way to tell a true story." Or, I think another one was that she loved how the story was told, that she hopes people loved it too. And so that's got to give you, pat on the back as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I'm grateful for that. I always had a good relationship with Priscilla. She liked the books I wrote about Scotty Moore, because Elvis just loved Scotty Moore. And so yeah, I was glad to hear that. And the fact of the matter is, when you get into this, you realize that directors like Baz Luhrmann, all directors, think in pictures. They're not wordsmiths. Baz Luhrmann has never published anything in his life. He's not into words. He's into pictures, and that's what he does very well. He creates these scenes. So basically, I've got a book of a true story with facts and all kind of information. And what a director looks at, well, what does this page inspire me to do a set of pictures, basically? And so that's the way it works. So I can't wait to see what he saw in pictures, really.
Well, we also want to encourage folks to go back and read the book. There's still time to get your book if you hadn't gone out to see the movie yet. If you've seen the movie, you can still read the book and sort of, see how the two parallel. And even if you don't plan on going to the movies and you're just an Elvis fan, I think this is, another side to his story that you would like to, uncover a little more. You uncovered a lot in your book about Colonel Tom Parker. He was a mysterious man, huh?
Well, he was. His real name was Andrea von Kusch. And with a last name like that, you can see why he would change it to Tom Parker. But he came here illegally from the Netherlands, entered through Tampa, which was wide open. They didn't check your paper, no matter where you came from, Cuba, Colombia, the Netherlands. They never checked your paperwork. They just said, come on in. And so it was just an open door, and he took it and thought, and he started to work for the Royal Carnival Company, which was the biggest in the country, and it was based in Tampa. And I was so lucky. I mean, a lot of his earlier life, I just could not document, because it's just, it was too long ago, and he was such a secretive person. But where I started documenting really well was when I called and talked to the owner of the Carnival Sun, who remembered working with Parker on the Carnival in 1931 and 32.
Well, James, I'm going to pause you there. We're going to pause in 1931 when Tom Parker was working in the carnival, and we're going to pick back up with that story coming up next here on Good Things. We're finding out more about the book behind the Elvis movie, which had a fantastic opening weekend. Again, it tied Top Gun with $30.5 million. And joining us is James Dickerson. He wrote Colonel Tom Parker, The Curious Life of Elvis Presley's Eccentric Manager, which the movie it's obviously titled Elvis. Were you surprised by that title, James? Because the movie is still kind of about Parker, or is it still focused on Elvis?
Well, I knew it would be titled Elvis because the premise for the movie was that it would be Elvis as seen through the eyes of Parker. And so you don't name the movie Parker because it's not about him per se. It's about the way he saw Elvis, and he was a con man, and he conned Elvis and everybody else. But so no, I'm not surprised. That's probably the best title you could ever come up with, really.
Well, yes, and it piques everybody's interest for sure. Okay, you left us in 1931, where you were doing your you weren't doing investigative work in 1931, but that's where your work took you to learn about Tom Parker. By that time, he had gotten the name Tom Parker when he was working in the carnival. What made him suspicious even back then?
Well, the thing about it was he made a good carny. He had different booths that he operated. One was a dancing chicken booth where the chickens would dance, and people would pay to see the chickens dance. But he didn't tell people that he had a hot plate under the chickens' feet to make them dance.
That's mean.
And he had a hot dog stand, and he wanted to make as much money as he could. So he would break the hot dog wiener in half and give them a full bun with half of the hot dog in it. And before the people got there, he would throw one of the halves down on the ground. If anybody complained, he would say, "Oh, well, you dropped your half. There it is on the ground." So he was a real con man.
So how did he meet Elvis? Of all the two worlds to collide, how did Colonel Tom Parker... Well, first, how did he get the distinction Colonel? It feels like a man like that wouldn't have earned it, or did he?
Well, in those days, governors in Mississippi and Louisiana and probably Alabama, their supporters, people that gave them money or political support, they would name them colonels. And being a colonel meant that if you got stopped for speeding, you didn't pay a ticket. And so he was named by Jimmy Davis, the governor of Louisiana, who was an accomplished singer, and his most famous song is "You Are My Sunshine." And it remains a popular song. But anyway, so he named him Colonel, and he thought, well, Colonel Parker sounds good to me. So he just kept using the name.
Well, it sounds like even before he met Elvis, he had this way of sort of creating a brand or, thinking in terms of entertainment and that sort of wow factor or whatever that would catch people's attention. So when did he collide with Elvis? When did the two of them meet?
Well, interestingly, as I said, Scotty Moore was his first manager. And Sam Phillips at Sun Records recommended that he do that before somebody grabbed hold of him and took advantage of him. So Scotty became his manager. And as part of his manager duties, he sent their first record and a bio and news clippings about Elvis to a Chicago company called Jamboree Attractions. And that was owned by Colonel Tom Parker. And so Parker got the record, and it sounded good to him. And Scotty had no idea of course, Parker would take his contract away from Scotty, but it was still Scotty who introduced it. And the backup to that, you may have read and heard a lot about Elvis's first performance at the Shell, Overton Park Shell in Memphis. Well, they were the opening act for a big country act at the time, Slim Whitman. And so Slim Whitman Whitman was just blown away by Elvis, and he let Parker know. He said the women just went crazy. I don't know what's going on. He's got all these dance moves and everything. So that got Parker, between him hearing from Scotty and hearing from Slim Whitman, he decided he needed to sign Elvis.
It's been said, James, that Parker really changed or elevated the entertainment industry with the way he managed Elvis's career, or it was groundbreaking at the time, whether it was good or bad. What did he do so differently? How did he, promote Elvis that maybe hadn't been done before, that, has snowballed him into fame?
Well, I think I differ. I think, and a lot of people in music at the time would agree with me. Elvis was going to be a major star no matter what. It was him. Nobody taught him how to sing. He didn't have a vocal coach. Nobody taught him those dance moves on stage. He just made them up. And Elvis, I think, was unstoppable. And I think Parker did very little in the early days. I mean, his biggest job was selling pictures to the fans. He would walk among the fans and sell pictures. But where I disagree, they say that Parker made Elvis successful, but his brand, if you think about it, the biggest brand you associate with Parker are those silly movies that Elvis made. The second is his Las Vegas residency. Now, for a rock and roll guy like Elvis Presley, the movie roles just killed him. And I interviewed one of his directors, actually, for his second movie, Loving You, Al Cantor, and he told me that he thought Elvis had the potential to be a great actor, but Parker wouldn't let him take great roles. So Parker kept him in that movie, and the sales of his records went down and down and down, and then he when he went into the Army and came out in 1960, the next month, he got out in March. April, he was on the set of G.I. Blues, and so over the next year or two, he had, I think, 4 number one hits. But because he was doing all of the terrible movie songs, he went for about 7 years without another hit. And so the movies took away what he loved, which was his rock and roll.
It's interesting, James, now so many musicians rush to Vegas for a residency. They all want it. But it feels like, that was, it just sucked the joy right out of Elvis's cape.
Well, yeah, I mean, he did over 600 performances during his like 5 to 6 year tenure there. And that's what got him on drugs. He was singing in the hotel, then he'd go upstairs to the penthouse, then he'd go down and sing again. He couldn't go anywhere. And so he turned to drugs. Just he wanted to sleep, and then he had to take drugs to keep him going, and that sort of cycle. So, see, I think most people would say, oh, Vegas, that's huge. Well, for most people it would be. But when you're the king of rock and roll, I mean, Elvis was the most incredible entertainer, I think, that we have ever had. And I think the Vegas thing was the final. When he finished his Vegas run, I think he just lived 2 years after that.
He literally was just spent. He was emotionally, physically, all exhausted. And the guy behind it all is this Colonel Tom Parker, which, for so many of us that's just learning this piece to it, especially my generation. I mean, there may be some, James, that know more about, Tom Parker than I do, but I'm like, I kind of get like a little bit of like, why didn't someone stand up to the bully, right? Why didn't someone say, that's enough, or Elvis be able to say that that's enough, I can find somebody else, or put their foot down?
Well, when in the early days when Elvis and Scotty Moore and Bill Black went out on the road, and then when Parker started representing Elvis, he complained to Scotty a lot. And Scotty told him just to stand up to him. I mean, he said, it'd be all right. You're a good property for him. Just tell him what you want. But Elvis wouldn't do it. And if you look, I sat down and made a list of the ways that he and Parker were different. And first of all, Parker was 26 years older than Elvis. He was old enough to be his father, but he had no fatherly instincts. He didn't feel that way toward Elvis. He didn't try to help him grow.
James, I'm going to pause you right there because that's good conversation. We'll pick right back up there with James Dickerson, author of Colonel Tom Parker. We're learning more about the book Warner Brothers purchased that inspired the new Elvis movie. It's titled Colonel Tom Parker, The Curious Life of Elvis Presley's Eccentric Manager. And we're continuing our conversation with author James Dickerson. You were saying, James, that they couldn't have been two different people, talking about Elvis and Tom Parker. Like, they had no chemistry, so it's crazy that their relationship even lasted as long as it did.
Well, it is. And I mean, okay, music was Elvis's life. Parker couldn't stand music. He never commented on Elvis's playing because he didn't understand it. He didn't listen to music in his spare time. Elvis was very religious. We know that. Parker didn't have a religious bone in his body. And you could just go down a list. Elvis loved people. He loved women. He loved their company, and he loved men. I mean, he had his buddies live in the house with him. Parker, he was married. You never heard of any scandal with women because he didn't associate with them, and he had maybe one or two male friends in his lifetime. So they were so different.
But yet Elvis, even though he had all those people, he had a wife that loved him, family, he still just felt this, tie to him.
Well, and I think probably there's enough evidence that Parker frightened him into that because his initial percentage for managing him was 25%, which was a lot for a manager. But Elvis agreed to it. And then there came a point, it was not unusual for Parker to lose $1 million in a night at the casinos in Vegas. And so there came a point to where he went to Elvis and had a talk and said, I'm going to have to raise my commission to 50%, half of what you earn. And I think that reason he was worried about losing Elvis's contract to the gamblers in Vegas. Now, in the 50s and early 60s, that was controlled by the mob, and Elvis knew that. Vegas has got a clean reputation now, but it wasn't that way in the 50s and 60s. And so I think Elvis was afraid of Parker's mob connections. I think that was part of it. But what I like about Elvis, he always believed in himself. I mean, he would have down days because of bad breaks or whatever. But that's, in Mississippi, Mississippi's got a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. But the good things, nobody taught William Faulkner how to write or Eudora Welty or taught B.B. King how to play the guitar and become a great entertainer. And Elvis, his destiny was to become the best entertainer of all. And that's what he did.
Well, how do you think the story would have ended if Colonel Tom Parker wouldn't have kept him from going international?
Well, he would have had even more success. It's that combination. He wouldn't let him leave the country, which was everybody wanted to see him overseas. He was huge, and then doing those movies and Elvis really wanted to be a good actor, and he was offered the male role in A Star Is Born with Barbra Streisand. Parker would not let him do it because that was a serious movie role. And I also should explain why was Parker so obsessed with these movies. Because he had a private deal with song publishers that he would put their songs and their music into the show, and he would get half of the profits from them. That was the kickback. So Elvis was just a pawn to him, and I have no problems telling people that Colonel Parker was a profoundly evil human being who, Elvis should not have died at the age he died. And I think Parker played a big role in that.
And that's one thing, that's part of the story, that if people go and watch the movie Elvis, they'll get to see it in movie form. And if they want to read it, they can read about that part of Elvis's life through your book, Colonel Tom Parker. I know, James, you are an investigative reporter, author, storyteller at your core. Elvis isn't the only one you've investigated and written about. What other books do you have out there that folks, if they like that kind of style, would be interested in?
Oh, I did the first book on the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which, the racist commission, and I did an investigative biography on Nicole Kidman, which one of the directors she worked with wrote me and commended me for it, and I did an investigative biography on Ashley Judd, which has been my best-selling book for I don't know how many years. But so anything. I don't just do biographies. I do investigative biographies, and the exceptions being the ones I wrote with Scotty Moore. I wasn't investigating him. I was just telling his wonderful story with him.
You mentioned at the beginning, Go Rebels. I know that you went to Ole Miss. Is that where you got into journalism?
No, that's where I got into rock and roll. I had 3 different rock and roll bands while I was at Ole Miss, but I was a psychology major, and I took some journalism courses, and I just decided a little later in life that I wanted to be a journalist, and my first full-time job was at the Delta Democrat-Times in Greenville when the Harding Carter family owned it. That's where I started.
And I know you had a long career, too, in newspaper. You'll find it funny that Rhino was saying Ole Miss fans are going crazy trying to find a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper today, because the print is of their, their great victory over the weekend. How important is it in the newspaper to have that front page cover?
Oh, well, that's very important. And that's one of the things that it turned out because of the stories I was assigned. I worked for the Jackson Daily, Clarion Ledger newspaper, Greenwood Commonwealth, the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, the Tallahassee Democrat in Tallahassee, Florida. And most of my stories ended up on the front page because I always investigated more than just the he said, she said thing. And so that usually got me the front page.
Well, you got any insider information where folks can find copies of today's newspaper if they can't find them on their local newsstand?
I have no idea.
The one time the paper should have printed extra copies would have been today when a Mississippi team makes, a national championship. But it'll be a keepsake for sure, which your book can be, too. I mean, I think this is really an interesting part of Elvis's life. Where can folks go to see all that you have written?
Well, we've got a website, sartorisliterary.com, SartorisLiterary, and you are familiar with that because we published 2 of your books.
Yes, you have. I will be on there. No movies made out of mine yet, but you know what? I'm like Elvis. I believe in myself.
Well, that's the key. You got to be positive. You got to believe in yourself, and just and persistence. They've always said that persistence is the key to success, and Lord knows I'm a persistent person.
Because remind us, when did you first publish Colonel Tom Parker? When did their work first start on this book?
It was actually published in 2001. So a little over 20 years later, and I'd done a lot of things in the interim. Then they come and I've got this golden egg. So that's what life is all about. Just you keep going, and if you do, something great will happen.
All righty. Well, I think that's a good note to end on it, and it bodes well, too, with Ole Miss and all they've done this weekend. They kept on going, and look, they came home as national champs. And I thank you for your time, James. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I really enjoyed talking to you.
All righty, and get out and see the movie. That's Elvis. If you hadn't heard, it tied the box office this weekend with Top Gun, $30.5 million the first weekend. I think that's only going to grow as folks get out and enjoy the upcoming holiday weekend of seeing the movie. I think this is one that Mississippians should get out and see and, and support. And how cool is it that a Mississippi author is the one who did the investigative work for the book that then inspired the great movie about, the Mississippi's greatest artist of all time and the world still. I think Tanya told us last week maybe Elvis still holds the record for albums sold or number ones or something. He's something. He's still the king at something.
Oh, yeah. But you mentioned how there might be a disconnect with our generation and some of what may seem like common knowledge about Elvis and his life and his legacy and his career and all these different parts that were Elvis. And you're right, because even growing up in Tupelo, Elvis's birthplace, I vividly remember growing up and having all these people from around the world coming to see his birthplace in my hometown. And I'm going, okay, I want to find audio. I want to find video from his international tours. He had to have gone to Japan for all these people in Japan to love him. And I couldn't find anything. And I'm like, something's wrong here. And it took several years before all of this information came to light. And it's like, wait, he never left the country. He did like 3 shows in Canada right across the border. And that's it. Everything else was in America.
Could you imagine if he would have done an international tour? Woo! All right, stick with us. We got more good things for you up next.